Now, Stuart, we've just heard from you. Wendy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Sorry. Professor at the University of Science.
Guy.
Hello. Oh.
There we go.
Right, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Southampton, and I wear many hats. But probably for this morning's panel, I should be wearing the UK AI Skills Champion hat. And I co-wrote the review of AI, which led to the UK spending 0 on it. I would dispute that just slightly, but it's a good point.
Nick.
Hi. So my name's Nick Jennings. I'm a professor of AI at Imperial College London. I've been an AI researcher for about 30 odd years now, and I also spent time in government as the chief scientific advisor for national security for 6 years.
Morning. Hello?
Yeah.
Is it working? Testing.
Do you want to pass, Nick, will you pass your mic for a second? Thank you, sorry.
Good morning. I'm Terah, Lyons, the Executive Director of the Partnership on AI. We're a nonprofit organization and a multi-stakeholder initiative with over 100 organizations involved spanning industry, civil society, and academia based in San Francisco, California. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And Stuart, we're going to come to you shortly on some of the points that you raised in your presentation. But Terah, if you would take a microphone, I'd love to start with you and just have you explain a little bit about your organization and some of the challenges that you guys have identified and the work you've been doing.
Sure. So the partnership was founded originally by a set of AI scientists and heads of research and development at a number of very large tech companies. So Amazon, Apple, IBM, Facebook, Microsoft, and Google were some of our original corporate founders. And they were joined by organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, the MacArthur Foundation, and a lot of other civil society and academic interests, actually. So our coalition includes organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as a number of university laboratories and institutes of study. And we are essentially trying to build best practices for the responsible development and deployment of AI. And the partnership was founded on the premise that no single organization is going to be able to do that effectively alone, spanning government to industry, frankly, where a lot of the power is situated right now. My personal background is in policymaking in the United States government, so I worked in the Obama administration working on AI policy issues for about the last 3 years of the second term of that presidency. And at the time, the private sector was investing in AI research and development at 8 times that of the public sector in the US, which is one of the countries that was investing most deeply. And so it's very clear where the levers exist for changing behavior, and PAI really exists to confront that lever, essentially.
I'd love you to talk about a specific example of the kind of challenges that you've taken on, because that's an extraordinary group of people to put together. I mean that getting events like this together is hard. I think actually you probably got the tougher job there. But what kind of problems are you specifically jumping on, and how do you get everybody to get aligned?
Well, the second part is definitely the hardest. We have a number of different theme areas, so we span the entire field, actually. We're working on safety critical, artificial intelligence. We're working on fairness, accountability, and transparency issues in a number of different areas. And I think actually the most salient example of our recent work is in the criminal justice domain. So we recently just released a report on the use of risk assessment tools in the US criminal justice system. And this is a big issue, especially in the US, where the criminal justice system is quite broken, frankly, and fairly racist, among other dynamics. And the state of California, just taking one local policy example, just passed a bill that abolished the money bail system and replaced it with a mandatory per county requirement to use algorithms to make pretrial bail determinations instead. And these tools are nowhere close to being where they need to be in terms of the quality assurance.
What are the issues? What's the issue with the systems?
Well, there's an incredible number of issues. It spans bias in the data that the models themselves are trained on, to more structural challenges like whether or not judges can actually interpret the tools when they're deployed in these local jurisdictions. So we released a set of requirements and standards, which are statistical and also structural, and really, hopefully, as these local governments start adopting policy measures of the sort, like the one that I described, they will listen to the community that we've pulled together on this topic, spanning different disciplines and sectors in the interests that they represent.
No, I mean, God, you couldn't get something more central than the criminal justice system to make sure we get these decisions right. Nick, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about and applying yourself to how AI is going to impact government, and you spent time in government. What's your perspective on where we are and the challenges and the work to be done?
Thank you. So I had a fascinating time in government and sort of have stayed in touch with it and very much involved in the last 3 years where I've left it. And actually I think government faces many challenges that many companies also face. So I think there's sort of a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about AI. I would say there's a real dearth of expertise within government to be able to make sense of what AI can do. So I see lots of departments thinking about, well, this intractable problem that we've had for the last 20 years, we're going to sprinkle a bit of magic AI dust or machine learning dust over it, and lo and behold, it will solve all of our problems. And sort of there's a lot of fear of missing out, FOMO, about AI in government. I think there's a feeling that it's something that should be done, but is not necessarily something that is being done. So I think there's that lack of expertise. I think I've seen in the last couple of years a sort of era of small-scale pilots and prototypes, taking a small bit of an organisation and sort of seeing what AI can do. But I'm yet to sort of see major government departments looking at and actually having it embedded in the real critical systems that are used for things.
And you wrote a recent paper on machine behaviour, and it covered a lot of really important issues around how we bring machine and humans together in a positive and cooperative sense. I think if you could pick one area that you think government should be cracking on with and really applying AI to, what would you single out?
So I'm very interested in sort of how AI will come into government systems and in more generally. And actually my real strong view is that I think the major modality, the main way this is going to happen is through human AI partnerships. So that's humans and AI working together, complementary expertise, different sets of skills, and really working together. And I think that sort of partnership piece is really important. And the paper which you very kindly referred to, available from all good websites, it speaks very much to understanding AI not just from a technical perspective, so not just in terms of the mechanisms and algorithms that are used for machine learning or for inference, but also understanding its impact on broader society. And it's that coupling of the two. And so I think some of the pronouncements and some of the things that people say about AI are too much driven from just one perspective, sort of imagining from the outside what AI might do without actually really understanding what it's like to actually build and program and work with a real AI system, or from the other side being too much focused on the details of your algorithm, trying to do better in your benchmarking tests, and not that understanding of the broader societal context. And I think it behoves us to make sure that we get that right and that people think about both together. Of these things.
Yeah, fascinating. Wendy, I know that there's a lot of parts of the government that you've been involved in, and not least authoring the industrial strategy paper, and obviously a lot of investment has gone in time, energy, and obviously you've made a huge contribution. It would be great to tee off that conversation around government and where we are heading, but also I know that you've got quite a global perspective that you've been developing, and I'd love to dig into that as well.
Well, just the first point, it's really important that the UK invests in AI. We have a great AI legacy. We bat above our weight in terms of AI because of the strength of the AI research groups we have at our universities and our tech startup culture. We have almost more than twice the number of AI startups that the rest of Europe has combined. So we have a lot to protect and to build on, and we can't just sit back and watch the superpowers of the US and China grow and not be part of this, because, as Nick said, we need to be using this stuff. We don't know how best to yet. We're a long way to go. But we really need to be using this stuff in the public and private sector to stay ahead of the game, and we could become, world leading in that sort of area. So it's really important that we do invest as we can. But the other thing I want to point at, what you're pointing to, is the global perspective, is that AI today, which is effectively machine learning, deep learning, requires data, huge amounts of data. That's why we can do what we do. But access that data is really crucial. And so data governance is as important as internet governance. It's a subset of it in a way. And we see, I've written a paper recently with Kieran O'Hara from Southampton called For Internet. So we're talking about the fragmentation of the internet, which will hugely impact this world.
What does that mean? Could you just to break it down in simple terms?
For granted, the open and free internet that we were given by the pioneers like the Vint Cerfs and the Tim Berners-Lees of this world, the open protocols. I'm just looking up your paper, I haven't found it yet. Machine Behaviour, I'm sure I will. Because I assume, because Nick's published that, he said it's available on any good website, I can find it. In the future, that might not be possible because of the way the internet is fragmenting. In the US, where all the big Silicon Valley companies are, well, that's fine. That's a tautology, isn't it? Because Silicon Valley's in the US, but you know what I mean. The others are in China. The big platforms are in Silicon Valley. That's largely market force-led. It's about making money for those companies, nothing wrong with that, and they lobby Washington to get the laws and regs they want, and want to keep it open and free. In Europe, we've gone for data protection. We've gone for GDPR, Generalised Data Protection Regulation. The two consequences of that for me at the moment are I can't shop on my favourite US closed shop website because they're not GDPR compliant, so they say you can't shop here anymore.
They've got a big enough market locally not to feel they need to do it.
At the moment, I don't believe we can read the Washington Post from here, right? For example. This is just... Now, it's laudable, GDPR is laudable, but the way it's been implemented is like doing AI with two hands tied behind your back, potentially. Because when you look at China, China's a completely different model again. If you do anything to do with data on the internet in China, you have to assume your companies have to make that data accessible to the government, Chinese government. And there's all sorts of consequences of that we could discuss at length. It's not all bad. Some of it, it's a safer place to be, but you give up freedom of press, freedom of speech. You could be slapped in jail for lying on the internet, all sorts of things. Russia is going the same way as China. India, same sort of size of populations. China could go the same way. It's a democracy, but it's got unique ideas to the internet. And then there's Africa. And we've just reached the 50-50 moment on the internet where 50% of the population is on the internet. That means there's 50% to come on the internet. And they're largely in rural China, rural India, and rural Africa. So the shape of the internet, the way it works and operates, could change really quite significantly in a few years, which will affect our freedom to develop some of the AI products and services differently in different parts of the world. And it's just something else, like Stuart was, we have to be aware of this, and the UK has to decide how it wants to play in this game.
And do you think that's a trend that's going to continue, or do you think it's something that there should be a call to action to try and address that fragmentation? I mean, is it inevitable at this point?
Nobody governs the internet, and the thing that is affected though by the data governance regulations, and data is regulated in countries and in regions around the world, and cultural regions. It's deeply different around the world. So, talking about governing it, making sure the internet is governed, you've got to actually make sure that you've got to get the countries to agree on how they govern data, and that's no easy task. But I do believe there is potential to do that, and I'll finish here by saying that at the end of May, there's a new Beijing Artificial Intelligence Institute, and they have produced a set of AI principles, and they are fantastic. They're really, really clear. And they say this, they don't want to be killed by AI any more than we do. But their governments may have different things they want to do in terms of controlling their citizenship. And I think there's a lot of potential for talk, and I know we're going to come on later to the really, really serious issues, and I do think now is the time to be talking internationally about these issues.
I think that makes tremendous sense, and the question certainly on my mind is always, what body is that, or bodies is that has that conversation? Because obviously we have things like the UN, we have lots of government initiatives, in every single country.
OECD's doing a lot of World Economic Forum's doing a lot of work, and it's at that level we've got to be operating. I wouldn't like to bet on any one of those at the moment, but
and you think
government needs to be lobbying, to be at that table and talking, helping make this happen.
Absolutely. I want to come back to Stuart and give you a chance to comment on these points, because I think this four internets concept is such a big one, and data obviously fuels AI. But Stuart, would you like to comment? What's your perspective on this point around governance and data behind AI?
I think there are governance issues that cut across the whole field of AI. And Wendy mentioned not wanting to be killed by AI. And we're actually trying through the UN General Assembly to get a resolution saying that you should not design algorithms that can choose to kill humans. That seems like something that's pretty common sense. At present, the UK government is opposed to that principle. So oddly enough, even though the UK government itself has declared that it will not use algorithms to kill human beings, it is opposed to a treaty where other countries would agree to do the same thing. So we have a sort of a contradiction, otherwise known as the UK wanting to commit military suicide. So I think we'll resolve that contradiction at some point.
I think that's a huge point, right? So why, leaving the UK's current policy, whatever it may be, aside for a second, why would anybody disagree with the idea that we would ban lethal autonomous weapons? I mean, that's a big topic.
Search me. I have no idea. Actually, I could think of a reason. You might argue that AI systems in the heat of battle might actually be less prone to start executing civilians because they're upset or to get revenge or whatever.
So less civilian casualties.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen fewer civilian casualties from semi-intelligent precision weapons, and I think you could argue perhaps that might continue. But I think actually this is more or less a red herring. The real issue is that autonomous weapons would be weapons of mass destruction, and we would see attacks on a vast scale because you're basically putting something that's more powerful than a nuclear weapon, but much, much cheaper, and can also, just for fun, be ethnically targeted at particular groups. So why anyone would want to create weapons of that form, I just can't imagine. However, okay, so let me talk about something more cheerful.
Yeah, I wanted to let the rest of the panel talk about that point just for a minute before we go on to the beneficial side of things. But obviously in the Partnership for AI, I don't know whether you have a specific policy on this, but on government and the work that you've been doing, Wendy and Nick, I mean, this is this is a huge point. Do you regulate, do you not regulate, and how does the UK or any other country make a decision on this and decide whether they participate or not?
So it is a complex issue in general about sort of where we regulate for computers and algorithms making choices. I think it's important that one disentangles sort of AI from computing in general. I hear lots of things about sort of AI shouldn't be used to control lethal autonomous weapons, and actually I think no computer algorithm should be used for that. Whether it's using AI or not is more or less irrelevant. And so I hear lots of things that are badged and targeted at AI, so bias in algorithms. there should not be bias in algorithms, and that's irrespective of whether those are AI-based algorithms or whether they're non-AI-based algorithms. So I think it's important to sort of distinguish and disentangle the piece about what's specific to AI and what we apply to algorithms and digital systems in general. I think it's important. I think in some places it's reasonably clear-cut that sort of, I would agree with Stuart, that sort of I think it would be inappropriate in general to have algorithms making choices about about who and where missiles are fired. For example, I think in general that some of the other decisions are more complicated and involved. I think there's a lot of interesting things around autonomous systems, and I think we need to have a proper societal debate about what we're willing to allow within our society. And part of the machine behaviour paper was actually arguing that it is that societal debate. Shouldn't just be left to people doing the tech, or just left to people who
Absolutely.
are philosophizing about it.
Yeah, and that's very much in line with what we try and do here by building an event that's inclusive and broadens the discussion. I mean, Wendy, is it even possible to get agreement to ban something like lethal autonomous weapons?
I think that's above my pay grade. I'd like to think it is. I'm totally with Stuart on this one. We need to work at that UN level to get these agreements, but I can also see why the British government appears to be schizophrenic about it. Because at one level you can say we're not going to do this, when you're actually negotiating at UN level, you can't blink before other people blink, or you're not going to agree until you know other people are going to agree. It's the nuclear bomb type thing, but actually better. And Stuart's made this point. I don't know if today or previously. I know he made this point. The chemical weapons agreement that has held since the First World War. That, well, more or less, apart from things going on in the Middle East and so on, but generally with the big powers, that's held. Because it was so awful in the First World War, they agreed and they didn't want to do that again. What we don't want to have to do is have that sort of calamity caused by AI and then have to agree it. We need to agree it before that calamity or that disaster happens, and that's what's so important.
Good. Well, I think it feels like everybody's in agreement that this would be a good thing to do, and it sounds like there's a lot of work underway. But as
Stuart said, it's sort of like a no-brainer. But getting there with the world powers negotiating is a much harder thing.
Well, the only challenge that I've heard to that whole debate is, are people able to create lethal autonomous weapons themselves today anyway, by buying things off the shelf and programming them? And how would you control that? And then obviously what happens if there isn't universal agreement?
Let's Stuart answer that.
So I mean, today people can also create chemical weapons. These are bog standard industrial chemicals. You go and buy them, you put them together and make chemical weapons. But the chemical manufacturers are part of the treaty. And so they are required to know their customer, they're required to account for large-scale purchases, and we also have a big intelligence operation to make sure that the wrong people are not buying chemicals. And because of the treaty, it's completely stigmatized. So when Syria uses chemical weapons, there's an international outcry, and the US feels entitled and is supported by the rest of the world community in sending cruise missiles to blow up half the Syrian Air Force, for example. There's absolutely no doubt that a treaty would have a very, very significant effect in reducing the nefarious uses of chemical weapons. And, just because it's possible for people to go out and shoot somebody or stab them with a kitchen knife doesn't mean we shouldn't have laws against murder. Right? We have laws against murder, even though sometimes people break those laws. Sure. It's still a good idea to have the laws. And the argument that we shouldn't have a treaty because someone might break the treaty, I just don't understand it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, it's great to have had that discussion, and I do want to move on to the optimistic and exciting future that we see ahead for AI. And maybe actually, you gave a great talk earlier, and the trillions of dollars that we have ahead of us. Some of the challenges we still need to address to make sure we can truly realize that. I think work that you've been involved in recently, leading some of around beneficial AI. Could you talk a little bit about that, Stuart?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I'm talking about this tomorrow morning in more depth, but in a nutshell, the reason why the standard model of AI, which is optimizing a fixed objective, doesn't quite work is that it's often impossible to specify the objective correctly. So, for example, if you say, I'd like to cure cancer as quickly as possible, we'd all like to cure cancer as quickly as possible. If you take that goal literally, however, probably the fastest way would be to induce tumors in the entire world population so that you can run millions of medical trials in parallel and find a cure most quickly that way. And of course, that's not what you meant. And we call this the King Midas problem, right? Because he said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. That wasn't what he meant. And when he got it, of course, that included his food and his drink and his family. And that was a big mistake. And so in AI, since the early 80s or even the late 70s, we've been completely comfortable with the idea that there's uncertainty in the world, that we can't have certain knowledge of our sensory information, we can't have certain knowledge of the dynamics of the world, how things are going to unfold, what's in other people's minds. Uncertainty is completely pervasive, but we totally forgot about the objective. We just continued to assume that there's perfect knowledge of the objective. And that was just a mistake. I don't really know how it happened, except that some twit wrote a textbook where he forgot to mention that there should be uncertainty in the objective. And when you think about that seriously, when you think, okay, a machine is supposed to optimize an objective, but doesn't know what it is, right? That actually makes the problem completely different from optimizing a fixed objective. In particular, it means that the machine is intimately coupled to the human being, because the human being is the source of the objective. And everything the human does provides evidence about their underlying preferences. And so the kind of AI I see going forward is actually a very different discipline. It's not one where the AI knows what it's supposed to be doing and is completely oblivious to the human. It's one where the AI is actually tied to the human, because the human could, for example, say, no, I don't like that, or do it this way, or, you know what, stop. And a classical AI system under the standard model would just ignore that, because it already knows the true objective, and it knows that whatever it's doing is optimal. And you just saying stop, well, so what? That's just hot air, right? But a system that knows that it doesn't know what the true objective is has to pay attention to the human. And I think, so the idea of beneficial AI is that we build systems this way, and you can actually prove under certain assumptions that at the moment are a bit too strong, but we will weaken them over time. You can prove that those systems are actually going to be beneficial to humans. And it'll be a completely different theory, and we have to sort of rewrite the textbook, unfortunately, from scratch.
Well, it's interesting because obviously it feels like there's so much momentum behind AI development right now, and you're pointing at like what feels like a really fundamental, area of work which is only just beginning.
So just to give you an example that you might already be familiar with, so we already talked about the idea of classifying images using machine learning. And so when you train those algorithms, you're minimizing what's called a loss function. And the loss function is supposed to say, what's the cost of misclassifying an object of type A as an object of type B? For example, what's the cost of misclassifying a human being as a gorilla? Well, Google did that. Google Photos did that in a very public way. And the answer is hundreds of millions of dollars, or maybe even billions of dollars of goodwill and bad public relations for Google as a result of one single misclassification error. Now, I bet you that they trained their classification algorithm with what we call the uniform loss function, meaning that all mistakes are equally bad. So misclassifying a Norwich Terrier as a Norfolk Terrier is just as bad as misclassifying a person as a gorilla. Well, clearly that wasn't the true loss function, but that was the loss function that Google used in their algorithm. And if you actually sat down and asked yourself, do I know what the loss function is? You'd say, no, I haven't thought about it. There's 20,000 categories, so that's 400 million possible types of errors that I could make, and each of them has its own cost, and I don't know what that's going to be. So I have to be doing machine learning under uncertainty about the loss function. And then you get completely different algorithms, even a completely different workflow for machine learning under those circumstances.
It's fascinating. And you know, in some ways it's comforting to know that we're obviously not as far ahead as perhaps some people think we are in the development of AI and you know, dare I say, general intelligence or superintelligence. But it feels like there's a lot of work to be done. Terah, is this an area that the partnership has looked at? And how do you think about, you know, getting the objectives of the AI right?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, this is an issue that spans several different areas of our work. I think just expounding on something that Stuart was describing earlier, I think at once the greatest, deepest beauty and also simultaneously the deepest terror of AI is that it's only as good as humans are right now. And the bias embedded in systems at a number of different stages of development and deployment is a huge limitation to effectively producing responsible technology right now. So, you know, I think that one thing we haven't talked about yet, but is extremely important to the field, both current and future states, is, for example, what the developer community looks like. And a big conversation in the partnership right now is how do we bring more people more inclusively to the table?
Sure.
These conversations around governance, either at the governmental or intergovernmental level, or even at the institutional level, where product managers are delivering and deploying technology in these companies every day. How do we diversify the people who are involved in making decisions on every single scale? So I think that...
and that diversity comes back to making sure that the data going into the system is not just the important part of diversity, but also the people programming the systems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a full stack set of interventions. It starts from training data, it spans to the context into which technology is or isn't getting deployed, and the sort of normative decisions we make as a technology community about how we're understanding contextual circumstances, structural inequity, jurisdictional differences, as we've talked about today, in whatever context we happen to be talking about.
So I wanted to switch topics just as we move towards the end of the panel, and we've got just about 10 minutes left to talk about one of the big reasons that we're all here, and want to, as Tabitha said, ask the question of how we can point our tools, tech, and talent of this industry at helping with the delivery of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd love to ask each of you, you know, to think about the opportunities you think are in front of us, both now and in the future, to really move the needle there. And Wendy, would you care to go first for that?
Well, I'm going to pick up on diversity, because I've been passionate about this for about 30 years, ever since I've been in computer science. And it's so sad for me that things are worse, if not better. And across, in our part of the world anyway, and in China, in other parts of the world it isn't. There are many, in India, Malaysia, Singapore, the East even. I go into a computer science classroom in a university and see more than 50% of the class are women, which is fantastic.
Amazing,
so it's not genetic, it's cultural. And it's much, much worse as AI, when I first started in computing, AI was not a subset of computer science. AI was philosophy and psychology and all to do with building things that work like the human brain. It has shifted, and the AI we're in now is a deep subset of computer science, and it's machine learning. And so we are taking a pipeline that's very not diverse on gender, particularly. I want diversity across the board, including nowadays age, right? But and accessibility. I walk with a stick, and getting up here is not that easy, Charlie. But for me, in gender, we've got a pipeline that's not diverse in gender, and we're taking that and taking a smaller. It's even worse than diversity in AI. And this is so important because of the bias issues. We're all biased anyway, but if you've got a very small subset of society building the algorithms, then it's not fit for society. And we've absolutely, absolutely got to make this part of the ethical framework. And the way that we regulate AI diversity has to be right up there in terms of if your company is not taking a diverse approach or has an interdisciplinary team, even in a small startup, you can surround yourself with people testing and other ways in which you can actually make sure that you're thinking about your product from an interdisciplinary and a diversity point of view. And we've got to put that right up the top. And we can do that now, even before, because one of the UN sustainability goals is gender equality.
Gender equality, yeah.
And when you see what's happening in India, as the internet rolls out and AI rolls out on top of that, the women are not getting the phones.
Yeah. How do you put some numbers around it? How big is it, Wendy, the diversity gap right now? Just give us.
In the world,
yeah, but so let's take the UK.
Well, and if you just take it in terms of developers, which is where Terah started.
Sure.
There was a wonderful tweet last week of the Apple Developers Conference, or a big developers conference in San Francisco, the Line for Lunch, and it was all, well, mostly young but white males, right? There wasn't, there was not one woman in that queue for lunch.
Right.
It is huge in AI, huge. And this conference, having got at you for mobility stuff, getting up here, we're doing a lot on diversity in CogX.
We are.
Absolutely.
It's a big focus.
It's a big focus. It's a big focus for the UK government. In the coming year, you'll see more and more about how I call it the Think the Unthinkable campaign. The things we've tried over the last 30 years are not shifting the dial enough at all, even. So we've got to think the unthinkable and do things that will make a difference quickly.
So before we move on from that point, because it is a huge one, and I know Tabitha was here, she would be saying exactly the same words, which is, so what can everybody here, listening and in the room, do to contribute to that? What's the most important thing they can do to move that forward?
Just talk about diversity all the time. Talk about everything else and then diversity, right? It's got to be part up front and central for everything to do with AI.
Brilliant, thank you. Nick, Sustainable Development Goals is the kind of...
Wider than diversity. Yeah.
Wider than... No, I know. Diversity is hugely important, and this is all we're going to have time for in terms of the closing question, but would love you to talk to your perspective on that.
Yeah, so clearly all the Sustainable Development Goals are extremely important. If I sort of look down the list, the one that sort of where I think AI can have a really strong impact is around health and well-being. I think sort of it is an area, both physical and mental health, where it's very much ripe for innovation. We have lots of data and lots of opportunity all around the world. So I'm not just talking about Western healthcare systems. I think we're on the cusp of being able to do and prescribe things and treatments and social treatments at a level that we've not been able to do previously. I think we can do it right down to the individual level, and I think that will really start to shift the dial around the world in terms of what we can do around health and well-being.
In the healthcare, yeah, brilliant. Are there any specific examples you want to bring up?
I think sort of if I go back to the partnership model, so sort of the humans and AI working together, I think the medical domain is a really strong example of that. I mean, computer algorithms are very good at recognizing images, and they're able to train on more images than your average clinician or radiologist is going to see in the whole of their lifetime. That just lets them see much more, but you don't want to just leave it to the algorithm. You want to be able to work with it, and sort of that's I think one of the real big challenges is not just getting better machine learning algorithms, but understanding from both sides of how partnerships with AI and humans work. So what does it mean for an AI to be a partner for a human, and for a human to work with an AI system? It's very different to working to a standard computer system, and I think work is needed on both sides of that equation. So
it's assisting doctors, assisting surgeons, assisting in diagnosis. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a huge one. Terah, is there an SDG you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, well, actually, instead of talking about one SDG, I think one of the most important challenges for this field is for the power players that we've talked about in industry especially to come to see the human values, human rights conventions that undergird the SDGs and other goals like them as being imperative to their business models. And I think that incentive structure doesn't really currently exist.
Right.
It's something we need to think really deeply about, very urgently.
Just give an example of what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the tech industry and frankly, any for-profit company is motivated by profit generation. And we've seen an upending of the industry in recent years, especially as coalitions of workers advocating for certain values within those companies have pressed those values upon their institutions. And I think that it's the start of a movement that we will see more to come of that type of behavior likely. But we really need to make this a global public conversation, and it needs to be, again, it needs to span governments, industry, and other players. But it needs to be one that really thinks about power structures and ultimately where empowerment is situated. And
Right.
I think that the conversation should just be limited to places like the UN. It really needs to be thought about widely and by the organizations that are really in the driver's seat right now.
Because there are discussions even in the UK about changing the Companies Act, and adapting it so that it actually has an element of social responsibility rather than just employees, shareholders, suppliers.
Definitely, that's a great example. There are other examples too where some organizations are experimenting with really novel capital structures that, whether windfall clauses or by other names, describe a more equitable way of distributing profits or other power generated by the sort of gold rush that we are in right now, if that's what you want to call it.
And it's obviously a huge conversation as we start to see jobs change and some jobs go and obviously new jobs come as to how those decisions are going to get made. I had a fascinating interview the other day where one CEO was saying of a US corporation, they were actually not going as fast as they could with automation because they didn't want to disrupt the local community where their head office was in the US. I think that's an interesting point of view, and it was really around the call center and billing center that they run.
It's actually pretty incredible. I mean, I think there are a lot of companies that are reshaping internal governance structures such that they can make decisions like that based on, again, values above profit in some circumstances. And there are different ways of justifying that to your shareholders, but at the end of the day, to be able to say that you've killed a deal over a principle that your institution is upholding is really, really powerful, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Stuart, the goals, the global goals, I know you've been spending some time in this area as well, so tell us.
So I just wanted to respond to something that Terah said. Yeah, so if you think about the profit motive, that is one of these fixed objectives. And Danny Hillis and some other people have been arguing that, in fact, there are already super intelligent AI systems that are pursuing these incorrect objectives and are destroying the world. They're called corporations. And so we should actually think about that. We really have created intelligent systems, and they are outwitting us, right? You wonder, why can't we get the climate right? Why can't we, fix CO2 emissions and so on? Because they have outwitted us. And we need to think hard about how we set up this optimization problem. So to come back to the SDGs in general. So Amir Banifatemi, who's over there in the front row, and I and a few other people set up something called the AI Commons, which is precisely about using AI, shared data resources and so on, to address the SDGs. And I'm very optimistic that we can, if we put significant effort into these kinds of applications, we can make real progress. So famine prediction is one example. Detection of the beginnings of deforestation, illegal logging in the Amazon is another. Understanding the dynamics of these growing cities in the global south, where the local governments actually have very little data about their own city. They don't even know where the streets are because they're not centrally planned in the same way that we traditionally do it in the West. And when you think about all these applications, it's not a mystery that you can use satellite data to solve a lot of these problems. And prototypes for this have been developed over decades. There are hundreds and hundreds of prototype projects showing that there are really cool things you can do with satellite data. And what's the result of all those prototype projects? A nice feeling, a report on a shelf, and then a bunch of software that doesn't work anymore. So what's the problem? The problem is that turning a prototype into a real 24/7 global service, something as available and as immediate and as global as Google or Facebook or any other of these global platforms, costs a great deal of money. Probably on the order for satellite data, so you've got to think about, okay, ingesting all of the satellite data, which is petabytes of information every day, storing it, processing it, and then making it available through some interface. This requires at least $1 billion investment upfront, and no one project and no one NGO can possibly manage that.
Justify that. Yeah.
But if we amortize it over hundreds of applications across all the SDGs, then we can do it. So, for example, Planet, which is right now the largest launcher of global observation satellites, is working on precisely this global platform on which you can then build applications for just a couple of million. You could put together a deforestation detector that's 24/7 online all the time, scanning the entire globe for deforestation efforts.
Amazing.
For famine prediction and so on.
Amazing. And I read that they put 180 satellites up, more than anybody else in the last 12 months or something.
Yeah,
it's quite staggering.
That's right. The visibility of the Earth is changing as we speak.
So this will be a constant stream of satellite imagery that other people can just tap into to create an application, maybe as a prototype to start with, but actually could be a production application running 24/7 at a small marginal
because
cost.
The platform already exists. It's like just adding a plug-in for Google Chrome or something like that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now we actually have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to ask the panel if there's, this panel was about the impact of AI on industry, government, and society. And Tabitha and I were talking earlier. There's a very positive and optimistic outlook at this conference, although we do love to run at the difficult challenges and the difficult questions, and thank you for those today. What's the most exciting use case that you've come across recently that really has kind of stopped you and made you think, that's just an awesome and magical use of AI or technology recently? Terah, do you want to go first?
I was hoping for a minute to think about that.
By all means, take a minute.
At the risk of being redundant, I think a lot of the healthcare applications are really, really extraordinary. I mean, the number of clinical errors that result in accidental deaths in hospitals, for example, is pretty astounding, and that is an issue that plagues a number of different countries. And I think the capability of reducing human error in the medical context,
diagnosis,
machine intelligence, whether the diagnosis or point of care center, I think is pretty amazing. But that's just the first one that comes to mind of many, many.
No worries. Nick?
So I would have said that, so let me say something else. So I think some of the things that are happening around education is really interesting at lots of different ages. I think the ability to tailor learning and experience and to really be able to...
So adaptive...
use advanced AI technology to help and again give that education to individuals that, in a way and a manner and a level that's specific to them. I think is a really exciting thing to be doing.
Yeah, that whole personalization and pacing of the coursework.
The personalization for me is sort of one of the main meta characteristics that AI can bring. The ability to tailor your education, tailor your health, tailor your experiences to you and what you want to do is for me one of the great promises of AI.
Right. And we have some great sessions actually about that coming up with Century Tech and others, Priya's company, talking about exactly how they're doing that today. So I couldn't agree more. Wendy?
I was going to say education.
The trouble with being third.
Yeah. So I'll finish with two things. One is actually what I'm looking forward to is my little automated pod that takes me to the doctors or the pub when I'm too old to drive myself. And I reckon that's going to be achievable, just about. I think that will be fabulous.
Is this a levitating...
Whatever it is, it's just, it could be life transforming for us elderly folk. No, stop it, Wendy, stop it. But I actually would like to say, while I was listening to Stuart's great talk this morning, some of the things we've been talking about, this made me feel a long way from people. It made me feel, how do I get involved? It's all too scary, or it's all too hard. And picking up on what Nick said, actually, the best thing I had this week, best email, not wasn't email, a tweet I saw this weekend was somebody saying, this little online course we've got going on, data science and AI for non-techies, was really a life changer for this person. And I thought, actually, everybody can get involved. It is not something that is going to be just for the geeks or just for the pointy-headed people and is going to ruin all our lives. Everybody can get involved because we can upskill, and that's my job as UK AI Skills Champion. You're going to see a lot of programs rolling out in the UK where everyone can get involved. And come on Wednesday, we've got the Girl Guides coming with their AI badge. Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. Stuart, I'm going to give you the last word and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay, what would be my favorite AI application?
Of all of the things you've seen.
You already took the best things. I think actually taking something from my talk, an application that could help the England team be better at taking penalties, absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Plays football together.
Thank you to a fantastic panel. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Terah. Thank you, Stuart.